This slide shows the disability categories recognized in the state of Virginia. The categories in red are the high incidence categories and are the categories that you're more likely to encounter as a co-teacher in a collaborative setting. It is important to remember that the categories of emotional disability, other health impairment, and specific learning disability require an ability level within the average range. Therefore, it is most likely that these students will be receiving instruction in a general ed setting. It is assumed with the correct supports and accommodations, if the ability level is within the average range, these students can most often be educated with their peers in a general ed setting. It's very important to understand the difference between a medical diagnosis and a special education disability category. Just because a student has a medical diagnosis, this does not make the student eligible for special education services under a specific disability category. For example, if a student has a medical diagnosis of autism, this does not mean that this student is automatically eligible for special education services under the disability category of autism. In order for a student to be found eligible for special education services, they must meet all the eligibility requirements as determined by an eligibility team. Another example would be a student who may be diagnosed with an emotional disorder. That disorder alone does not make that student eligible for special education services under the category of an emotional disability. The student must meet the eligibility guidelines before they are found eligible for services. In all cases, there are three criteria that must be met for eligibility. First, the eligibility team must determine that the student has a disability. Now, there are guidelines for each disability area provided by the state. However, it is left up to each local school district how they will interpret those eligibility guidelines. Next, it must be decided that the disability is impacting the student's learning. If the student has autism, but that autism is not impacting their learning, they may not be eligible for services. If a student has an emotional disability, but it's not impacting their learning, they would not be eligible for services. Third, after it's determined that the student has a disability and that the student's disability is impacting their learning, the third criteria must be met, which says that the student must require specialized instruction due to the impact of the disability. In all cases, each of these areas must be looked at closely and determined by the special education eligibility team. In the next few slides, we will be looking at some guidelines for eligibility determination for high incidence disability areas. A specific learning disability is basically a processing disorder. This disorder may impact a student's ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. One learning disability that's getting a lot of attention recently in Virginia is dyslexia. In fact, every teacher, as a part of licensure, must now take specific training in how to identify dyslexia. It's important when identifying a student as having a specific learning disability that such factors as intellectual disabilities, sensory impairments, and emotional disabilities, or environmental issues that may have impacted the student's learning are ruled out as the major cause for the deficit before that student is labeled with a specific learning disability. It's always been a challenge as to how to diagnose a specific learning disability or a processing disorder. There are three models that have been practiced widely in the state of Virginia, one being the discrepancy model, which simply compares a student's ability with their achievement. If a student is significantly underachieving and it's determined that the student has received appropriate instruction, then it is assumed that that student must have a processing disorder. Along those same lines, response to intervention model also looks at underachievement, but with that underachievement, there's a time period when the student is provided intensive research-based instruction in specific areas while their progress is monitored. If that progress monitoring does not show any response to the intensive interventions, then again it is assumed that this must be due to a processing disorder. More recently, the model of looking at patterns of strengths and weaknesses has become popular in the state of Virginia. This is a little more scientific way of looking at a specific processing disorder. This involves the psychologist performing a battery of tests and then analyzing those tests to look for patterns of strengths and weaknesses in specific areas. Looking at the definition of an emotional disability, it's important to remember that the emotional concerns must have occurred over a lengthy period of time. This is so that students who may just be having a normal, natural emotional reaction to some kind of life event, such as the death of a family member or some kind of other trauma that they may have encountered, are not identified as having an emotional disability. Also, it's important that that emotional disability is severe enough to adversely affect a child's educational performance. In looking at the child's issues, we must determine that the child's behavioral issues are not due to social maladjustment. In the state of Virginia, a student cannot be placed as having an emotional disability if their behavior is simply due to social maladjustment. The most common disorder for students with other health impairment is attention deficit and hyperactive disorder. However, other conditions, as you see listed here, may also have an impact on a student's strength, vitality, and alertness, which would impact their ability to learn. And in that case, these students would also qualify as having an other health impairment. The category of intellectual disability is based on sub-average general intellectual functioning as well as deficits in adaptive behavior. Many students with intellectual disabilities, especially those in the mildly intellectually disabled range, are able to perform and function and progress in the curriculum in the general ed setting. It is important when you're serving these students that you address those deficits in adaptive behavior as well as the deficits in academic areas. Autism is a spectrum disorder, and on this spectrum there's a wide range of ability levels. Students with autism may have significant cognitive impairments, or they may have an ability level well above average. Regardless of the ability level of students with autism, there's always a deficit in the areas of social interactions and communication. And these deficit areas must be addressed through your instruction as well as their academic needs. As a special education teacher serving students in a general ed setting, you'll be working with students with a wide variety of disabilities. However, there are some characteristics that are often common among students of all disability areas at the secondary level. These include poor organization. Our students often have disabilities that impact their executive functioning skills. Therefore, they have difficulty planning their days, pacing their work, or organizing their materials. It is good to be prepared to support students in these areas. Distractibility. Emotional conditions can impact our sustained focus, as can ADHD or cognitive impairments. Poor self-concept. Students who have struggled academically or who have required special help sometimes develop a poor self-image, and they need opportunities to strengthen that. Related to poor self-concept is lack of motivation. Sometimes our students do not have good goal-setting skills or do not understand how to make a plan to meet their goals. Poor social skills and poor problem-solving skills. An area that often is a weakness for our students, and an area that we know more than ever is so important for success, not just in school, but in employment and in life in general. So there again, we need to be prepared to support our students in all of these areas to help them meet their ultimate goals of success. There are two important takeaways from this slideshow. The first is be familiar with disability categories and be prepared to address all deficit areas within each of those categories. This means if you have a student with autism, be sure that you're not just addressing their academic needs, but that you're also looking at their social skills needs, their communication needs, their behavioral needs. If you have a student with an emotional disability, again, make sure that you're addressing those behavioral needs, those emotional needs, as well as their academic needs. If you have a student with intellectual disabilities, as their special education teacher, you need to make sure you're addressing those adaptive skill deficits as well as their academic needs. And be familiar with those common characteristics and make sure that you're delivering instruction or supporting your students in such a way that you are helping them to overcome some of those common characteristics that may hold them back from meeting their fullest potential.